I secretly watched my Apache widow neighbor for 10 years, and then I learned she had noticed. It all began on a quiet street in a small town that seemed almost frozen in time. The houses were modest, each with a little garden in front, and the people who lived there were mostly quiet, keeping to themselves. The man had just moved into the neighborhood. He was in his late 20s, a little reserved, and not very social, though he always liked observing the world around him. He liked noticing small things that others often overlooked. It made him feel connected to life in a way that talking with strangers never did.
From the moment he arrived, one house caught his attention more than the others.
It was a modest, single-story home, with a faded wooden fence and a small garden full of flowers. The house belonged to a woman he would later know as the Apache widow. She lived alone, and there was something about her presence that made the house seem alive even when it was quiet. She moved with calm confidence, her movements deliberate and graceful, and she seemed to carry a history that no one else could fully see. At first, the man's interest was purely curiosity. He noticed small details, the way she tended to her garden, planting flowers carefully in the morning sunlight. He saw how she hung her laundry with care, smoothing out wrinkles, and how she swept her porch in the late afternoon. To him, these were not ordinary actions. Fresh. There was a rhythm, almost a ritual, in everything she did, and it fascinated him. He began to find himself looking forward to catching glimpses of her daily routine. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Every time he came home from work or errands, he found himself glancing at her house, trying to see her through the windows or across the street. Sometimes he would notice her walking slowly down the street, carrying groceries or a small basket, always with a kind of quiet dignity. There was no sense of showiness or attention-seeking in her behavior. But she seemed content in her own world, and yet, to him, she became the center of his own imagination. He told himself it was harmless. After all, he was not bothering her directly, just observing from a distance.
He even tried to rationalize his fascination.
Rasp. She was strong, independent, and mysterious in a way that no one else in the neighborhood was. He imagined the life she must have had before, the challenges she had faced, and the losses she must have endured. She was a widow, and though he didn't know the details, he could sense the quiet strength it took to live alone for so many years. Each observation made him feel closer to understanding her world, even if he was only a distant spectator. As the months went by, he began keeping subtle notes in his mind. Notebooks or diaries might have seemed strange, so instead he simply remembered details. He remembered what flowers bloomed in her garden during each season, the color of the curtains in her windows, the way she always wore a scarf around her neck in the colder months. He even noted the times she would leave the house and return.
Every small observation became a thread in a tapestry he was slowly weaving about her life. The man's life outside this quiet obsession started to change.
He had friends and colleagues, but he didn't feel the same excitement in talking with them. Conversations at work felt dull compared to the subtle movements and routines he watched across the street. At home, he spent more and more time on his porch, hoping to catch a glimpse of her in the golden light of the evening. It was as if the rest of the world had faded into the background, leaving him with only the details of her life to notice and admire. Despite this growing fascination, he never once considered approaching her directly. The thought of knocking on her door seemed impossible, as if it would shatter some fragile balance he had created. He told himself that the distance was necessary, that observing quietly was safer and more respectful. In his own way, he felt protective of her privacy, even as his attention bordered on obsession. Over time, he noticed more than just her routines. He noticed her personality through small gestures. The way she smiled politely at neighbors who passed by, the way she spoke softly when helping a child carry something heavy, or the way she would pause sometimes, looking thoughtfully at the sky or the trees. Each action revealed a layer of her character, and he began to admire not just her habits but her strength, her kindness, and her quiet wisdom. Seasons changed, and he watched her adapt to each one with the same calm determination. In spring, she planted flowers that would bloom bright and colorful, carefully choosing where each one would go. In summer, she spent time tending her small vegetable patch, watering plants in the early morning before the sun grew too hot. In fall, he noticed her raking leaves into neat piles, sometimes taking the time to admire the colors before letting them go. In winter, she would light a small fire inside, and he imagined her sitting by it, drinking tea, and thinking about her past and the life she had built for herself. He began imagining small stories about her life. Bed. Sometimes he pictured her as a young woman full of laughter and hope before tragedy had touched her. Other times he imagined her finding joy in quiet moments, a walk in the park or a conversation with a friend. His imagination blurred the line between what he saw and what he created, but he convinced himself it was harmless. After all, no one was hurt, and he was only noticing things that already existed. Despite his fascination, he remained careful. He never let his observations interfere with her life. He never called attention to himself, never lingered too long in view, and never spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. To anyone else, he might have seemed like a man who enjoyed his quiet evenings on the porch. But in truth, every glance, every moment of noticing was part of a private ritual he had built over months, and eventually years. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, he realized he had been observing her for over a year. It was not a single moment, but a gradual awareness, a slow accumulation of attention and care. He felt a mix of pride and guilt, pride for having noticed so much, and guilt for the secret he carried in his mind. Yet he could not stop himself. There was a magnetism to her life, a sense of depth and resilience that drew him in endlessly. They also began to notice his own life through the lens of watching her. He compared his routines to hers, his small achievements to her quiet strength. It was humbling in a way he had never expected. Watching her taught him patience, observation, and the importance of small gestures. He realized that life's beauty often existed in the unnoticed, the ordinary actions that spoke of character and resilience.
Neighbors sometimes asked him about the widow, but he would only smile and say she was a quiet, lovely person. No one suspected the depth of his attention or the years he had spent noticing her life from afar.
It was his secret, a private window into a life that fascinated him, and, in a strange way, gave him purpose. The first part of his journey ended not with any dramatic event, but with a quiet recognition. He realized that this quiet observation, this patient noticing of small details, had become a part of who he was. It had shaped the way he saw the world and had brought a sense of meaning to his otherwise ordinary days. For now he remained on the porch, watching the soft light fall across her garden, content to learn and appreciate from a distance, unaware that the story he had just begun would span a decade of careful, secret observation. Years passed, and what had started as simple curiosity grew into a quiet, almost unnoticeable part of the man's life. It was no longer just about seeing his neighbor in passing or admiring the way she tended her garden. He had settled into a routine, a careful rhythm of observation that shaped his days. From the moment he woke up in the morning to the time he went to bed at night, her life was always somewhere in the back of his mind. He noticed small details that most people would never see. The way she arranged her flowers in the garden, the way the sunlight caught the strands of her hair in the morning, even the way she paused for a moment to breathe in the scent of the earth before starting her work. Each observation felt like a tiny piece of a puzzle, revealing a little more of who she was. Over time, he began to feel a connection with her that went beyond mere curiosity. It was a strange, private bond that existed only in his mind. He did not interact with her directly. There was no knocking on the door, no attempts at casual conversation. To him, the distance was necessary.
He feared that any direct contact might destroy the careful balance he had created.
He imagined that she was part of a story he was writing silently, a story in which he could understand her without risking the fragile peace of her life.
Every day he found himself looking forward to seeing her, even if it was just for a few moments across the street.
As the years rolled on, he became attuned to the rhythms of her life in ways that surprised even him.
He could tell when she was having a good day just by the way she moved through her house or garden. On days when she seemed quiet and withdrawn, he noticed small hesitations in her actions, a slower pace in her walk, or a lingering glance at something distant. Brask. He began to imagine the stories behind these small gestures, weaving them into a narrative that he kept in his mind. Seasons passed like chapters in a book. In spring, he watched her plant new flowers and care for seedlings, her hands gentle yet sure. Summer brought long afternoons of gardening, watering the plants and tending to the small vegetable patch she had cultivated with care. In fall, he observed her raking leaves and placing them neatly in piles, the colors of the leaves reflecting the quiet beauty of her life. Winter was the hardest to watch, as she spent more time inside moving quietly around her home, and he imagined her sitting by the fireplace lost in thought. Each season added layers to the understanding he was building, each detail deepening his quiet fascination. Even as he watched her, life outside this quiet obsession continued. He worked, had friends, and went about his daily routines, but everything felt slightly distant compared to the silent attention he paid to her life. Whereas conversations at work or with neighbors seemed trivial when measured against the subtle, meaningful movements he had grown to notice. At night he would often sit on his porch, the world quiet around him, replaying the day's observations in his mind, examining each gesture, each small smile, each thoughtful pause. He was careful, always. His observations were quiet, unobtrusive. He never stayed too long in one spot, never made any movements that might catch her attention. In his mind he was a silent guardian of sorts, watching without disturbing. He convinced himself that his actions were harmless, even noble, because he never interfered in her life. Grasp. Still, deep down, he could not deny that his attention had grown into something more than mere curiosity. It was part of him now, a hidden current running quietly beneath the surface of his daily life. Over the years, he began noticing small interactions she had with other people. Neighbors who waved at her, delivery people she greeted politely, friends who stopped by occasionally. Each interaction told him more about her character, her kindness, and her strength. He admired the way she carried herself, the patience she showed, and the quiet dignity in every word and gesture. In his mind, he began to imagine conversations with her, imagining what he would say if he could ever speak freely. But he never did. The silence, he believed, was safer. Sometimes he imagined the life she had lived before he noticed her. He thought of the challenges she had faced as a widow, the moments of sadness she must have endured, and the resilience it took to carry on alone. These imaginings filled him with a mix of empathy and admiration. He respected her strength, her independence, and the way she seemed to create order and beauty in her world despite the hardships life might have dealt her. As his quiet observation continued, he noticed changes in himself. He had become more patient, more attentive to small details, and more aware of the beauty in ordinary life. Watching her taught him lessons that no one else could, about resilience, care, and the power of small, meaningful actions. He began to see patterns in his own life reflected in hers, and it gave him a sense of quiet purpose. His fascination was no longer just about her. It was about understanding the world through the lens of someone who had lived through struggle and still found ways to create beauty. But over time, a new feeling began to creep in, a subtle, persistent doubt. He started noticing small things that didn't make sense. Sometimes he thought he saw her glance in his direction, though he was never sure.
Occasionally she would do something unexpected. A flower moved slightly from where he remembered placing it. A window opened when he thought it had been closed.
These small discrepancies made him uneasy, though he tried to ignore them. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of the mind after years of careful observation. Narration. Still, he could not help but feel that perhaps she had some awareness of him. A small part of him worried that his silent attention had not gone unnoticed. The thought frightened him, but he could not stop. 10 years had passed since he first noticed her, and the habit was now a part of his life. To break it would be to lose a part of himself.
And so he continued, careful, patient, and ever watchful.
His life became a delicate balance. He maintained distance, yet the pull of observation was strong. He found ways to integrate it naturally into his days, watering his own plants at the same time she tended hers, taking walks that allowed him to glimpse her quietly, arranging his schedule so he could notice the little details that brought him a sense of calm and connection. The routine became comforting, almost meditative, a private rhythm that structured his life without anyone else knowing. Despite the growing intensity of his attention, he remained respectful. He never interfered with her life, never tried to speak to her unnecessarily, and never crossed boundaries. In his mind, he was learning from her, understanding the world through her quiet actions and gestures. He imagined her as a teacher, a guide who had unknowingly imparted wisdom through her daily routines and the small, deliberate choices she made.
Over the decade, he noticed changes in her as well.
She grew older, of course, but she carried herself with the same quiet dignity. Her hair turned silver, her movements slowed slightly, but the grace and strength he had admired from the beginning remained. He began to appreciate the depth of her resilience even more, understanding that strength was not always loud or visible. It could be quiet, steady, and unwavering. And then one day he noticed something different, a feeling, a small shift in the air, something that made him pause and reconsider everything.
He thought he saw her glance directly toward his house, though she quickly looked away.
He felt a small, unexpected rush of fear and curiosity. Was it possible that she had known all along? The thought was unsettling, yet also strangely thrilling. For 10 years he had believed himself invisible, a silent observer. Now, he was not so sure. The idea that she might have noticed him added a new layer of tension to his quiet routine. He began to notice even more subtle details. The way she arranged her curtains, the way she sometimes paused near the windows. He imagined scenarios in his mind where she had seen him, considered him, perhaps even wondered about him in return. The possibility that she had been aware all along changed the dynamic of his observation.
It was no longer just about curiosity. It was about understanding whether the bond he had built in silence was recognized in any way.
Right. And yet, despite this uncertainty, he could not stop. He had invested too much of himself, too many years, into these quiet observations. The daily glimpses, the imagined conversations, the careful attention to her life. It had become a part of who he was. Even the fear that she might know did not deter him. Right. Instead, it added a layer of excitement and tension, a secret knowledge that something had shifted beneath the surface of their quiet world.
By the end of the second decade of his observation, he realized that he was no longer just watching.
He was part of a delicate, unspoken rhythm, a silent connection that had existed for years without words. He had learned patience, empathy, and the beauty of noticing life in its smallest details. And now, for the first time, he understood that perhaps she had been aware of him all along, sharing in that silent rhythm in ways he could only imagine.
Years of quiet observation had turned into a habit so deeply ingrained that the man hardly realized how much of his daily life revolved around her.
He still went about his routines, work, errands, occasional outings with friends. But in his mind, the neighbor's life was always present. Every small gesture, every subtle movement held meaning to him. He knew when she would water the flowers, when she would sweep the porch, and even the moments when she paused to watch the clouds drift across the sky. It was a rhythm he had memorized over time, a secret choreography that he followed without fail. But then, things began to feel different. He noticed subtle shifts, small details that seemed out of place. One afternoon, he was watching her prune a small rosebush when she suddenly looked directly in his direction. She didn't wave, she didn't speak, but for a brief moment, her eyes met his. Breath. The man froze, a chill running down his spine. He quickly looked away, pretending he hadn't seen her. For the first time in all these years, he questioned whether his presence had been invisible. Could she have known about him all along? Breath. After that moment, he became hyper-aware. Every glance, every shadow, every movement from her house seemed to carry a hidden message. When she placed a chair slightly differently on the porch, he imagined it was deliberate. When she closed a window he thought was open, he wondered if she was aware of him watching. His mind began creating countless possibilities, some exciting, some frightening. The certainty he had once felt, the idea that he could observe her life without consequence, was slowly slipping away. At the same time, he felt a strange thrill. The possibility that she might have noticed him added a new depth to his routine. Observation was no longer one-sided. There was a silent tension, an unspoken awareness that neither of them openly acknowledged. He began imagining the reasons she might have noticed him, wondering what she thought, if she had questions, or if she simply ignored it to maintain her own peace. This new uncertainty made every small moment feel charged with meaning. He also began paying closer attention to her interactions with others. He noticed the subtle way she greeted neighbors, the way she smiled at delivery people, and how she helped children or friends who passed by her house. Every interaction became more significant. He tried to compare her polite gestures towards others with her behavior when she thought she was alone. Was there something different? Breaths. Something deliberate. He began seeing patterns, or at least imagining them, that suggested she might be aware of more than he had ever realized. Sometimes he thought he could sense her reactions even when he wasn't watching directly. A neighbor would mention seeing her looking out the window, or a delivery person would describe her pause before opening the door. Raven's small pieces of information fueled his imagination. He began to feel as if she were conducting a silent test, seeing how he would behave, how carefully he would continue to watch. It was a strange, almost playful tension that neither of them acknowledged, yet it permeated every moment of his observation.
He also reflected more on his own feelings.
The fascination that had started as curiosity was now layered with anxiety, guilt, and excitement. He was thrilled by the idea that she might have known, yet worried about the implications. He questioned his own behavior, wondering whether his decade-long habit had crossed boundaries. But he could not stop. The routine had become part of him. It was a delicate balance, awareness without interference, observation without intrusion, fascination without confrontation. One evening he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. She had left a small object on her porch, something that had not been there before. A small figurine, carefully placed facing toward his direction. He could not be certain, but it felt intentional. His mind raced with questions. Was this a message? Was she signaling that she knew, or was it a coincidence, a random act that his imagination had transformed into significance? He studied it from his vantage point, hesitant to approach, afraid to move too soon.
The suspense was unbearable and thrilling at the same time.
From that point on, every action she took seemed loaded with meaning. When she adjusted her curtains, when she rearranged flowers in the garden, when she paused in the doorway before entering the house, he analyzed every detail, trying to interpret intentions he could not confirm. He was careful not to let his curiosity show in any visible way, but his mind was constantly working, connecting dots, imagining reasons, predicting patterns. He felt like a detective trying to solve a puzzle where only half the pieces were visible. Despite the tension, he remained respectful. He never confronted her, never knocked on her door, never spoke to her unnecessarily. In his mind, this was still a silent exchange, a private understanding that existed in a space where words were unnecessary. He imagined that perhaps she understood him, as he understood her, even without acknowledgement. He clung to the idea that some connections could exist without verbal communication, a delicate form of mutual awareness. At the same time, he began to notice how much he had changed over the years. His patience had deepened, his attention to detail had sharpened, and his appreciation for the small moments in life had grown. Observing her had taught him lessons he could not have learned anywhere else. The value of careful attention, the beauty of ordinary actions, and the quiet power of resilience. She had become a teacher in a sense, though she had never spoken a word to him. Every gesture she made carried meaning. Every small action revealed something about life that he had never noticed before. There were also moments of fear. Occasionally he imagined what would happen if she confronted him, if she knew more than he suspected. Would she be angry? Disappointed? Would she think he had crossed a line? These thoughts made his stomach tighten and his mind race. But at the same time, he could not imagine stopping. 10 years had passed, and stopping now would feel impossible, as if a part of himself would be lost. The tension became a strange form of comfort, a pattern he had learned to live with even as it filled him with uncertainty. Over time, he began imagining conversations in his mind. He pictured how she might speak if she had confronted him, the words she might use, the calm, measured tone he imagined she would have. He rehearsed responses, trying to find the balance between honesty and respect. These imagined conversations became a form of preparation, a mental exercise to understand what might happen if the quiet tension ever shifted into reality. Then, there were the small signs that could not be ignored. A window slightly open when he thought it was closed. A glance in his direction that lasted a second too long. A gesture that seemed deliberate, though he could not be sure. Each of these moments filled him with a mixture of fear, excitement, and curiosity. He began to notice how much he had relied on the assumption of invisibility. Now that assumption was challenged, and the uncertainty was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. The man realized that the quiet observation that had been so safe for years was beginning to change. What had once been a private, solitary activity now carried the possibility of recognition, of acknowledgement, of confrontation. The tension added a new dimension to his life. It was no longer enough to simply watch. He had to consider the implications, to imagine her awareness, and to anticipate her reactions. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle movement became a puzzle he desperately wanted to solve. Despite the growing tension, he remained committed to his principles. He did not interfere with her life, did not cross boundaries, and maintained a careful, respectful distance. The balance was delicate, but he was determined to keep it. The years of observation had taught him that patience, discretion, and attention to detail were as important as curiosity. And now, these lessons were more necessary than ever, as he faced the possibility that she had noticed him and that their unspoken connection might be more real than he had ever imagined. By the end of this period, he understood that the dynamic between them had shifted. He was no longer a silent observer of an unaware neighbor. There was a chance, small, uncertain, but real, that she had been aware of him for some time. The knowledge both excited and terrified him. It was a turning point in his quiet, carefully structured life of observation. He knew that something had changed, and that the next steps he took, consciously or unconsciously, would define the remainder of this long, secret journey. For years, the man had believed he was invisible, a silent observer of a life that fascinated him. But one morning, something changed. It started as a small, almost unnoticeable sign, a way she placed her chair differently on the porch, the careful alignment of a flower pot facing his house, the subtle positioning of the curtains. He hesitated, staring for a moment, and then realized that these small details could no longer be coincidence. She might have known. At first, he felt a mix of fear and disbelief. Could she have really been aware of him all this time? The thought made his heart race. 10 years of careful observation, every glance, every tiny note in his mind, and now the possibility that she had noticed it all was overwhelming. For the first time, he wondered how much she had understood, and what she might think of him. Was she angry? Curious? Amused? This uncertainty was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. That afternoon, he decided to watch more carefully. He observed from his usual spot, heart pounding, eyes fixed on her movements. She was outside, tending her garden as she always did, but now there was a deliberate quality to her actions, round in despair. She paused in places where she had never paused before, and for a moment she looked directly at him. Not in surprise, not in fear, but as if she knew exactly who he was. She held his gaze for a second longer than seemed natural, and in that second he felt a connection that had been missing for years. For the rest of the day, he couldn't focus on anything else. Every small movement she made replayed in his mind. He analyzed the position of her hands, the way she leaned over the flower beds, the quiet rhythm of her walk. It was no longer a simple observation. It was a dialogue of glances and gestures, a silent understanding that stretched across the distance between their houses. He realized that the bond he had imagined in his mind might have existed in reality all along. The next day he noticed something even more deliberate. A small object had appeared on her porch, positioned carefully where he could see it from his vantage point. It was a tiny figurine, a bird made of clay, facing toward him. He stared at it, heart thudding, unsure whether it was a playful gesture, a message, or simply coincidence. But the placement felt intentional. For the first time, he understood that she had been aware not just of his presence, but of his attention, and she had chosen to respond in her own quiet way. He began to imagine what she had thought over the years. Had she wondered why he always lingered on his porch at certain times? Had she noticed the careful attention he paid to her garden and her routines? Perhaps she had watched him from inside her home, understanding his curiosity without saying a word. The thought was both humbling and exhilarating. He realized that the story he had told himself for 10 years, of being a silent, invisible observer, was no longer entirely true. One afternoon, as he watched her prune the roses, she looked up and smiled. It was not a casual neighborly smile, but one that seemed to carry meaning, a quiet acknowledgement.
He felt a rush of relief and anxiety at the same time.
Relief because she was not angry, and anxiety because now the delicate balance he had maintained for years was about to shift. He understood that a confrontation, whether verbal or unspoken, was inevitable. Later that week, something finally happened that he could no longer ignore. She stepped out onto her porch and walked toward the edge of her property, closer to his house than ever before. He froze, unsure of what to do. She stopped, smiled softly, and spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and full of warmth. She said something simple, something that immediately dissolved the tension that had built up over years. She had noticed him. She had known, she said, for almost as long as he had been watching. The revelation hit him like a wave. 10 years of silent observation. 10 years of imagining stories and gestures. And now it was confirmed. She had been aware all along. And yet, instead of anger or judgment, there was understanding, and even a touch of amusement in her tone. But She had chosen not to confront him until she was ready, not because she condoned the behavior entirely, but because she understood the loneliness and curiosity that had driven it. He could hardly speak at first. Words failed him as he tried to process the confirmation, the unexpected kindness in her voice, and the strange relief of finally knowing the truth. In that moment, he realized that the connection he had felt for years was real, even if it had been silent and unspoken. She had acknowledged him, and in doing so, she had transformed the dynamic between them completely. Over the next few days, he noticed subtle changes in her behavior.
Oh! She would occasionally leave small, meaningful gestures where he could see them, like a flower turned toward his house, or a note on the door that simply read, "Good morning." These actions were quiet and deliberate, creating a dialogue without words.
He realized that she had her own way of participating in their unspoken connection, and it was both humbling and comforting. The man also began to reflect deeply on his own behavior, and taught him patience, observation, and appreciation for life's small moments, but it had also revealed the dangers of secrecy and obsession.
Now that the secret was out, he understood that connection required honesty and respect.
The realization made him think about the way he had lived in the shadow of curiosity, and how much richer life could be when shared openly, even in small ways. She never forced a conversation or demanded an explanation. Instead, she allowed the recognition to exist naturally, letting him come to terms with it in his own time. The first few encounters were quiet, filled with gestures, brief glances, and small smiles that carried volumes. He learned to appreciate the simplicity of these interactions, understanding that true connection did not always require words. Every moment became a lesson in humility, patience, and the power of mutual understanding.
Slowly, he began to take small steps toward real interaction.
A polite greeting in the morning, a small wave when she passed by, even brief conversations about the weather or the garden. These interactions were carefully measured, respectful, and genuine. He found that even the smallest gestures carried more meaning than years of silent observation had ever conveyed. He began to understand her life in ways that were deeper than anything he had imagined in his secret reflections. One evening, she invited him to help with a small task in her garden. It was a simple request, nothing grand, but it symbolized a huge shift. For the first time, he was no longer an observer. He was a participant, engaging in a shared experience built on years of silent attention. The act of helping, of being present, created a new dimension in their relationship, one based on mutual respect and understanding rather than curiosity and distance. As days turned into weeks, their interactions grew naturally. He learned more about her life, her history, and her resilience. She shared stories of her past, of the challenges she had faced as a widow, and of the small joys that had sustained her. He listened attentively, realizing that the real story, the lived story, was far more complex and inspiring than anything he had imagined from his silent observations. Each story strengthened his respect and admiration, reminding him that connection and understanding are built through patience, empathy, and shared experience. He also reflected on the journey that had led to this point. 10 years of quiet observation, filled with curiosity, imagination, and careful attention, had finally transformed into genuine human connection. He realized that what he had learned through silent watching, attention to detail, patience, respect for boundaries, was only the beginning. The true lessons came from engagement, empathy, and the courage to step out of the shadow of observation and into the light of shared experience. By the end of this period, the man understood that revelation had changed everything. The silent tension that had defined a decade of his life was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding, a mutual respect, and a bond built on shared recognition. He had learned that true connection is not about watching from a distance, but about engaging with honesty, respect, and empathy. And though the past 10 years had been filled with secrecy, curiosity, and reflection, they had ultimately prepared him for this moment of understanding and transformation. After the revelation, the man's life felt lighter in a way he had not anticipated. The secret he had carried for 10 years, the silent attention and careful observation, no longer defined him in the same way. There was no shame, only reflection, a chance to consider what he had learned, what he had missed, and how he could live more fully and honestly. The quiet connection he now shared with his neighbor was no longer based on distance, secrecy, or imagination. It was real, grounded in mutual understanding and respect. In the days following their first acknowledgement, he found himself noticing her in a different way. Before, he had focused on the routines, the gestures, the small details of her life, always careful to remain hidden. Now he could observe without the burden of secrecy. He saw the warmth in her smile, the sparkle of curiosity in her eyes, and the quiet confidence she carried as she moved through her home and garden. It was no longer a one-sided fascination. He realized he was witnessing a person, not a puzzle or a story to be imagined. Their interactions began slowly but naturally. Simple greetings in the morning, brief conversations about the weather, or comments about the garden filled the gaps left by years of silent observation. Every word, every exchange carried significance. He discovered that genuine connection was richer and more meaningful than anything he had imagined in the quiet corners of his mind. While his previous years had been filled with imagination and careful attention, these real interactions carried an authenticity that no observation could ever replicate. Over time, he found himself learning more from her than he had expected. She spoke of her past with honesty and humility, of the challenges she had faced as a widow and the small joys that had carried her through lonely days. He listened intently, absorbing the lessons embedded in her stories, resilience, patience, and the quiet power of living fully despite loss. For years he had admired her from afar, but now he understood the depth of her life, the courage behind her daily actions, and the strength that allowed her to keep moving forward. Helping her with small tasks became part of their new dynamic. A simple chore in the garden, arranging flowers or carrying groceries, slowly transformed into a shared routine, one built on mutual respect and trust. He realized that these small acts of assistance were more than just helpful gestures. They were ways to show care, support, and attention without crossing boundaries. Every interaction was a lesson in empathy, teaching him the importance of presence, patience, and thoughtfulness. He also reflected on his own growth.
The years of silent observation had not been wasted, though he now understood their limitations.
They had taught him attentiveness, patience, and the value of noticing details, but they had also shown him the risks of isolation and secrecy. Through the process, he had come to appreciate the delicate balance between curiosity and respect, admiration and boundaries. Now, he had the chance to apply these lessons in real life, creating genuine connection instead of observing from afar. Sometimes he thought about the decade he had spent watching her quietly. It had been a strange mix of fascination, empathy, and loneliness, and yet it had shaped him profoundly. He realized that the lessons learned in those years, attention to detail, patience, and reflection, were valuable, but they were only the beginning. True growth, he understood now, came from engagement, from honest interaction, and from the courage to step out of the shadows of secrecy into the light of genuine connection. Their relationship, though simple, became meaningful. They shared stories, laughter, and quiet moments of understanding. He learned to appreciate the beauty in ordinary actions, the way she carefully arranged flowers, the way she brewed her tea, the way she paused to enjoy a moment of sunlight. These small details, once observed from a distance, now became shared experiences, moments of connection that strengthened their bond. He found joy in participating in her world, rather than merely watching it. He also became more mindful of his own life. For years, he had lived in the quiet rhythm of observation, his world defined by distance and imagination. Now he began to notice other aspects of life with the same attentiveness he had once reserved for her. He appreciated the kindness of neighbors, the beauty of daily routines, and the value of small acts of care. The lessons of patience, empathy, and attention became a guide for living more fully, not just in relation to her, but in every aspect of his life. One day, while helping her with her garden, he realized how much their connection had changed him. He had gone from being a silent observer to an engaged participant in her world. He understood the importance of honesty, respect, and shared experience. The tension, uncertainty, and curiosity that had defined years of his life had transformed into trust, understanding, and genuine companionship. He felt a sense of completion, not as an ending, but as the beginning of a more balanced, fulfilling way of relating to others. He also reflected on the idea of boundaries and respect. For 10 years he had existed on the edge of her life, careful not to intrude. The revelation had taught him that respect for others' privacy is crucial, but so is the courage to engage when the moment is right. He realized that admiration alone, when left unspoken, can create isolation and misunderstanding. True respect involves attention, care, and the willingness to connect meaningfully, even if it requires vulnerability. Through their quiet interactions, he learned the value of patience. Connection could not be rushed. It developed slowly, like the careful growth of flowers in her garden. The small gestures, the moments of shared attention, and the gentle understanding between them built a foundation stronger than any fleeting fascination. He realized that relationships, like gardens, require time, care, and observation, but they also require participation, respect, and openness. By the end of this chapter of his life, the man understood the importance of balance. He had learned from years of observation, from moments of tension and uncertainty, and from the quiet acknowledgement of the woman he had admired from afar. He had grown in patience, empathy, and understanding. And he had learned that true connection comes not from watching, imagining, or projecting, but from engaging with honesty, respect, and care. In the final moments of this period, he reflected on the journey that had begun 10 years earlier. What had started as curiosity had evolved into understanding, growth, and genuine connection. He realized that his fascination had been a doorway opening him to lessons he might never have learned otherwise. But the true reward came from stepping beyond observation into real life, from transforming silent admiration into shared experience. The man also recognized the quiet beauty of her resilience. For years he had admired her strength and dignity from a distance, but now he saw the depth of her courage and grace, fully. Brash. Every story she shared, every lesson she imparted, every small gesture of care taught him more about life than he could have imagined. He learned that admiration alone is incomplete without understanding, that fascination is enriched by respect, and that the bonds of connection are strongest when built on shared experience. Their shared moments became a rhythm of their own. Simple routines, quiet conversations, and shared work in the garden filled their days with meaning. He found joy in her presence, not as a distant observer, but as a participant in life's small, meaningful moments. The silence that had once defined their relationship was replaced by shared attention, laughter, and understanding. He realized that the depth of human connection is not measured by intensity, secrecy, or duration alone, but by respect, presence, and genuine care. As the years moved forward, he continued to grow alongside her. Their bond, built initially on curiosity and observation, had matured into friendship, trust, and mutual respect. He understood the value of patience, the importance of boundaries, and the joy of shared experience. The lessons of his secret years had been important, but the lessons of engagement and understanding were even more profound. He learned that life's richest moments are those shared with others, where admiration transforms into participation and fascination transforms into understanding. By the end, he realized that the story of 10 years of silent observation had become a story of growth, reflection, and meaningful connection. He had learned about patience, empathy, respect, and the subtle power of everyday actions. He had discovered that real connection requires honesty, courage, and the willingness to step beyond the comfort of secrecy into the richness of shared experience. And, most importantly, he had learned that admiration, when tempered with respect and care, can evolve into genuine friendship, understanding, and human connection. The man finally understood that the journey he had taken, through curiosity, tension, revelation, and reflection, had transformed him profoundly. The years of silent observation had prepared him, teaching lessons he could not have learned any other way. But the real reward was the connection he now shared with her. One built on trust, respect, and the quiet joy of being present in each other's lives. He smiled, realizing that the past 10 years had not been wasted. They had been a prelude to a life of genuine connection, understanding, and shared humanity.